My wife's father asked me to forgive her and pay for the baby she had with another man while she blamed me for her infidelity. My wife and I were together for 4 solid years, married all that time. Honestly, I thought we had a good relationship. We had plans, a whole life planned out, and I really thought we were on the same page. Now, here's the thing. We both wanted kids, or so I thought. Right after we got married, we started talking seriously about it. She always said she wanted 2 or 3 kids. She talked about the names we'd give them, how she'd decorate the nursery, all that stuff. She even spent hours online looking at baby clothes and items, planning this life with our future kids. It was something we always talked about, something that kept us connected. So we were excited, ready to start this new chapter together, and everything seemed perfect. But then we got some bad news that knocked the wind out of me. After a few months of trying for kids, we went to the doctor to see what was going on. Long story short, the problem was me. My sperm count was way too low, and the doctor basically told us that the chances of having kids naturally were slim to none. It was like a punch in the gut. I felt useless. All those plans we had just vanished in an instant. The news hit me hard. I ended up in a really bad place for a while. Eventually, therapy helped, but in the beginning, I was a mess. At first, she seemed pretty supportive, saying that it didn't matter and she'd be happy with just the 2 of us. Don't get me wrong, I understand people change their minds, but her attitude was weird to me. She went from daydreaming about baby names to completely avoiding talking about kids. And not only that, but she also started seeing me differently. Suddenly, she was making little comments, things she'd never said before, about how I wasn't taking care of myself, how maybe I should get in shape or be more productive around the house. And yeah, maybe I had gained a couple of pounds, but it was like she was looking for something to blame me for. When I confronted her, asking her what was going on with the sudden change in attitude, she brushed it off. She told me I was imagining things, that I was being too sensitive. But I knew something was up. The woman I married, the one who used to sit with me for hours talking about our future, was different. She wasn't exactly mean, but there was this coldness, like she'd already mentally checked out and was just going through the motions. Over time, I started to believe her when she said everything was fine. I stopped pushing because I didn't want to seem insecure or needy. A few years went by, and we were just living day to day. We'd fallen into a routine where we barely talked about anything meaningful, like we were roommates instead of husband and wife. I tried bringing up other options, adoption, surrogacy. But every time I did, she'd shut it down, saying she didn't want to think about it. She said she'd be happy as long as we were together. But I never believed her. It all felt like she was trying to convince herself more than me. Then, out of the blue, she tells me she wants to go on a trip with her friends. It wasn't unusual for her to go on trips with her friends. She'd done it several times before, and I always supported her. We lived in Britain, and she was talking about how she wanted to go to America with her friends for a while. I didn't think twice about it because we'd built that trust over the years. So I even helped her pack, making sure she had everything she needed, and drove her to the airport. I remember the last thing she said to me before she left was, "Thank you for being so understanding." I thought it was a little weird that she said that. It's not like I'd done anything special. But she seemed so sincere, so I let it go, thinking she was just grateful. That night, I stayed up to call her when she landed, just to make sure everything had gone okay. Her flight was supposed to be about 9 hours, so I kept myself busy at home, watching TV, checking the clock, and waiting for her text that she'd arrived. When I saw that her flight had landed, I gave her a call to see how she was doing. The phone rang and rang, but she didn't answer. I figured she was tired, maybe went straight to the hotel and fell asleep, so I didn't think much of it. But then morning came, and I still hadn't heard from her. I started to get this worried feeling in my stomach. I tried calling her again, then sent a couple of texts, thinking maybe she was busy or her phone was on silent. But after several hours with no word, I started to panic. I ended up calling her sister to see if maybe she'd heard from her. Nothing. By that point, I was really freaked out. I even called her friends, the ones she was supposedly on the trip with, thinking maybe something had happened to her phone or maybe she hadn't had a chance to contact me. But when I called them, they were confused too, because they weren't on a trip with her. They were having coffee 2 blocks from my house. That's when it hit me. She wasn't on a trip with friends. She wasn't with anyone. She hadn't gone anywhere with anyone. She'd just gone. I stood there holding the phone and felt my stomach drop to the floor. I couldn't understand it. Why would she lie to me like that? Why would she just leave without saying anything? I tried to convince myself that it was some kind of mistake, like she'd missed a connecting flight or there'd been some emergency and she couldn't call. But deep down, I knew she'd planned it all. The friends trip, the thank you for being so understanding, it was all part of whatever she'd been cooking up in her head. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was living in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. This wasn't the woman I married. It was someone I didn't even recognize. All the pieces started falling into place. The coldness, how she stopped talking about our future, those little jabs about my appearance and my health. She'd been distancing herself for a long time, and I just didn't see it. Or maybe I didn't want to see it. That night, I sat there staring at my phone, waiting for a text, a call, anything. But nothing came. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Waking up the next day, I remember just lying there staring at the ceiling, hoping maybe it was all some weird dream. But her side of the bed was empty and reality hit hard. She'd really gone. Packed her bags and vanished. All those things I told myself the night before, that maybe she got lost or her phone died, didn't make sense anymore. It was obvious she had planned this and wanted to leave. The first few days, I was in total denial. I kept calling her phone, hoping to hear her voice on the other end, maybe get an explanation. I even left messages. I didn't know what to say half the time, but I kept leaving them, hoping something would reach her. But all I got was silence, which somehow made it feel worse. It was like I'd been left alone to figure it all out, with no clue what had gone wrong, as if I'd always been a stranger to her. At first, her family was just as surprised as I was. Her mother didn't know anything about her plans, and they hadn't heard from her either. I ended up going over there more times than I can count, talking to her mom, looking for answers. I think they felt bad for me. Her mom would let me stay some nights, even make me meals when I couldn't bring myself to cook. She'd sit there and listen to me talk about all these little things that didn't make sense, trying to piece together how my life had just blown up without warning. And to be honest, sometimes I'd just sit there in silence, too numb to say anything. I went from one extreme to the other: anger, sadness, guilt. I kept asking myself what I had done wrong, if there was something I'd missed, if I hadn't paid enough attention. There were days I'd replay every conversation we ever had, every fight, trying to understand what led her to leave. I kept turning it over in my mind. How could I have saved our marriage? What could I have done differently? I know it sounds dramatic, but I was obsessed with finding an answer, as if finding a solution could fix everything. I barely ate, barely slept. And my work started to suffer too. People noticed. They'd ask if I was okay, and I'd just shrug and say I was dealing with some personal stuff. It was embarrassing to admit what had happened, to say out loud that my wife had left me without a word. Eventually, I told a couple of close friends, and they did their best to distract me, taking me out, trying to get me to move on. But even when I was with them, I was still thinking about her, wondering where she was and why I wasn't enough to make her stay. One of the worst parts was the constant questions from people who didn't know: neighbors, family, friends, even ex-colleagues who knew I was married and would ask, "How's the marriage? And how's your wife?" AC. Each time was like ripping off a fresh scab. I didn't have the guts to tell them she was gone, so I'd just smile and say everything was fine. But that lie felt heavier every time I said it. Therapy ended up being the only thing that helped. I'd never gone before, but after a few months of just barely functioning, I knew I couldn't handle it alone. So I found a therapist and started going every week. Talking to someone neutral, someone who didn't know her or me or our story, helped. I vented about my anger, the betrayal, the emptiness she left in my life. I talked about the sleepless nights, how I'd lie awake replaying everything over and over again. The therapist helped me see that there wasn't some magic bullet that would have kept her here. She made the choice to leave, and that was her responsibility, not mine. It was hard to accept. For a long time, I felt like there was something wrong with me, that I had somehow driven her away. But slowly, I started to see things differently. She'd been cold and distant for a long time, and I'd ignored it, hoping things would get better on their own. I'd convinced myself that I could hold it all together, that my effort alone was enough to keep our marriage alive. It was painful to accept that it wasn't. Over time, I started taking small steps to rebuild my life. I'd lost so much of myself in our marriage, and I didn't realize it until she was gone. I'd always been the guy who made an effort, who made sure she was happy, that our home life was comfortable. But now I had all this free time and I didn't know what to do with it. So I started picking up old hobbies, things I'd forgotten about. I went to the gym, started reading books I'd left unfinished, even tried cooking new recipes. Work started getting better too. At first, I was just going through the motions, barely managing to keep up with my workload. But as I started feeling more like myself, I put more effort into my job. It was one of the few things that made me feel accomplished, like I still had control over something in my life. I'd always been good at what I did, but now I was giving it my all. The extra hours, the focus, it paid off in the form of a promotion I never would have gotten if I'd stayed wallowing in self-pity. Still, there were days that hurt. Every now and then, I'd come across something that reminded me of her, a photo, an old movie ticket, little things that brought back memories I was trying to forget. I'd look at them and wonder, what's she doing? Does she ever think about me? Does she ever regret what she did? But those moments started to fade, little by little. Each time, I could push those memories away faster, move on a little easier. I also reconnected with friends I hadn't seen much of since I got married. We started doing things together, going to the golf course, hiking, things I hadn't done in years. It felt good to have people in my corner, people who weren't part of the mess, who could help me move forward without dragging me back into the pain. Looking back, I realized I'd put too much of myself into that relationship, into being a husband. When she left, it felt like she took a part of me with her, like I'd lost a huge chunk of who I was. But little by little, I was finding my way back. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but I was doing it. Towards the end of that year, I could finally look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't defined by what she'd done. I was more than the guy whose wife left him. I'd survived. I'd rebuilt myself, and I'd come out stronger. For the first time in years, I felt like I could actually live my life without her shadow hanging over me. And honestly, I felt proud of that. I thought I had put it all behind me. Life was finally starting to feel normal again, or at least as close to normal as it could be after all that mess. I had my routine, my friends were keeping me busy, and work was great. I even stopped thinking about her every day. I mean, I still had my moments where some random memory would sneak in, but it wasn't like before, when every second of my life was somehow connected to her. So when someone knocked on my door one Saturday morning, she was the last person I expected to see standing there. But there she was, right on my doorstep, holding a baby. I froze. My brain just stopped working for a second, because it was like seeing a ghost. She looked practically the same, maybe a little more worn down, but it was still her. She looked at me like she really thought I'd be happy to see her. And yeah, that stung, because I thought I didn't care anymore. Turns out, seeing her again stirred up a lot of emotions I thought I'd buried. At first, I didn't say anything. I just stood there staring. She smiled, like nothing had happened, and then, without a shred of shame, asked, "Can I come in?" The nerve. After everything she did, just showing up here like I was going to welcome her with open arms. But I kept my cool and said no. Stay there and explain. I didn't want her inside my house, bringing all that chaos back into the place I'd rebuilt, the one space I'd made my own. She looked a little surprised, but stayed where she was and started telling her story. She started by saying, "I know this might be a surprise, but I want to come back and explain everything." She even had this hopeful look on her face, like she genuinely believed I'd be willing to listen. I was between laughing in her face or just slamming the door shut right then and there, but I was too curious. I wanted to know what her excuse was, what she'd cooked up to justify the way she disappeared. She went on about how she'd made a mistake leaving, how she'd realized she'd lost the best thing that ever happened to her. Her words, not mine. She said she'd spent a lot of time reflecting, and that after having this baby, she finally understood what truly mattered in life. Apparently, what truly mattered was showing up unannounced on my doorstep after disappearing for years. And that's when she looked at the baby and said, "This is our second chance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our second chance, as if this kid was some kind of magical reset button and we were just going to pick up where we left off. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was absolutely furious. She kept saying how she wanted us to be a family again, that she'd made a terrible mistake, but that we could start over now, just the three of us. I finally asked the question that had been eating at me since she showed up. "Why did you leave?" I tried to keep my voice as calm as possible, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold it together. I spent years trying to understand, torturing myself with every possibility. And now that she was here, I needed to hear it from her. She hesitated, looking at the ground like she was ashamed. But finally, she told me the truth, or what I guess was the truth. She admitted that she left because she wanted a child, and since I couldn't give her one, she found someone who could. She said it like it was no big deal, like it hadn't shattered my life, like I was just supposed to be okay with it and accept it. She explained that the guy she left with didn't stick around, but by then, she'd already had the baby and realized she wanted me back. Just like that. It took me a minute to process what she was saying. There she was, admitting that she abandoned me, went off with another man, had his child, and now expected me to be fine with it. Like I was just going to forgive and forget. I said, "So you left, found someone else, had his baby, and now you think you can just walk back in and pretend like nothing happened?" She started crying, saying she was sorry, that she'd made a huge mistake. But that didn't move me one bit. She kept saying how she realized I was the one she truly loved and that we were meant to be together. Honestly, I was struggling to keep a straight face. I couldn't believe how delusional she sounded. This wasn't love, it was desperation, and I could see it on her face. Then she tried to guilt-trip me, saying it hadn't been easy being a single mom, how hard it had been for her. She really tried to play the victim in all of this, as if her decisions hadn't led her exactly to where she was now. She told me she needed my support, that she was ready to make things work this time. Meanwhile, I was just thinking, who does she think she is? I stood there, listening to it all, but at that point, I didn't want to hear any more. I told her straight up, "You made your decision a long time ago, and now you have to live with it. There's no second chance here." She looked stunned, like it never occurred to her that I would say no. Like she really thought she could waltz back into my life because it suited her. And just when I thought she would finally get it and leave, she got angry. Her tone changed, and she started yelling at me, saying I was being selfish, that I owed her a chance to fix things. She said if she'd wanted to, she could have divorced me back then and taken half of everything. She even had the audacity to mention the house, saying it should still be hers. It was like her true colors came out right in front of me, and I felt this wave of relief. I was finally seeing her for who she really was. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and said, "It's over. You wanted another life, and now you have it. This isn't my responsibility anymore." With that, I slammed the door in her face, cutting off any final words she might have said. I heard her yelling on the other side of the door, but I felt this strange calmness wash over me. She could bang, scream, cry all she wanted, but I knew I'd never let her in again. The woman I loved, the woman I married, was gone, and in her place was this stranger who thought she could pick up the pieces when it was convenient for her. I walked away from the door and sat down, feeling lighter than I had in years. After slamming the door, I figured that was it. I thought she'd get the message and leave. But no. Instead, she started banging on the door, screaming all sorts of things. I couldn't believe the nerve. There I was, in the one place that was mine, the one place I'd managed to rebuild from the mess she'd left me in, and she had the audacity to stand there demanding I listen to her. At first, I thought about ignoring her, letting her scream herself hoarse. But then I got curious. I wanted to know what excuse she'd cooked up this time. So I opened the door, just enough to show her I was listening, but not letting her in. It was like I'd slapped her across the face, probably shocked that I hadn't given her the reaction she was hoping for. She started this whole monologue about how she was willing to forgive me for slamming the door in her face, and how she was ready to start over, like we were having some normal fight without addressing her abandonment. She kept saying how we could make things work if we both just put in the effort. At that point, I couldn't help it. I laughed. I actually laughed because the audacity of this woman was beyond anything I'd ever seen. She looked furious when I did, like she expected me to feel bad for not taking her seriously. I said, "You left. You had your chance, and you blew it. I'm not going to pretend like none of that happened just because you want to." Her face went red, and she started saying things like, "You don't understand how hard it's been for me." She went on about how lost she'd felt after leaving and how she realized too late that she'd made a mistake. But I didn't buy it. I told her that leaving was a choice she made. She planned it, lied about it, and then went through with it. Her regret didn't mean anything anymore. And that's when she really lost it. Her tone completely shifted. She dropped the sad, regretful act and started screaming at me, saying I was being unfair, that I didn't have the decency to give her a second chance. She even had the gall to say that if she'd wanted to, she could have left me with nothing. At that moment, she could have taken half of everything I owned. I just stood there dumbfounded. This woman who left me without a word now thought she was entitled to some kind of reward for not trying to financially ruin me. Like she deserved recognition for not being as terrible as she could have been. I said, "So I'm supposed to be grateful? Grateful that you only left me and didn't take my things?" She stared at me, her face a mix of anger and something else, maybe desperation, maybe guilt. But honestly, at that point, I didn't care anymore. I was done. After all those years of feeling guilty, questioning myself, trying to make me feel like I was the one losing out by not taking her back. It was bizarre. There she was, the one who had destroyed everything we had, acting like I should be begging her to stay. When she saw I wasn't going to budge, she got even more hysterical, saying that I had forced her to leave in the first place. She claimed that if I'd been more understanding about the kid thing, none of this would have happened. According to her logic, my inability to give her a child meant that I had failed as a husband, which somehow justified her going off to have one with someone else. The mental gymnastics were impressive. Honestly, I couldn't believe she was trying to blame me for her choices. I told her plainly, if you so desperately wanted a child, you could have told me the truth. You didn't have to lie to me and pretend everything was okay while you were planning your exit. She didn't have anything to say to that. She just stared at me like I'd slapped her. But I didn't let her speak. I continued, "You made that decision on your own, and now you have to live with it. That's not my problem." She tried one last tactic, putting on this sad face and asking me to think about the child, that it was unfair of me to turn my back on him. She had the kid in her arms and really tried to use him to guilt me, like I was the villain here. But I didn't fall for it. I told her, "I don't know that child. I have nothing to do with him. He's not mine, and neither are you." And that was it. I could see the realization finally hit her. She knew I wasn't going to change my mind, that there was no way I was letting her back into my life. I watched the anger drain away, replaced by something else, maybe genuine regret, maybe just frustration. But I didn't care anymore. She was a stranger now. A stranger who had tried to walk all over me and expected me to smile and thank her for it. She stood there for a few more seconds like she was waiting for me to change my mind, to call her back. But I didn't say another word. I just stood there looking at her until she finally got it, that I really meant it. Then, without looking at her again, I closed the door. And this time, I didn't wait for her to knock again. I knew, deep down, I'd made my decision, and there was no going back. I walked away from the door feeling, I don't know, like I'd finally won. She'd spent so long thinking she could just walk back in and manipulate my life again, but it was over. I was free. There would be no second chance, not for her, not for us. She was just a memory now. When I finally put all of that in the past where it belonged, after so many years of guilt and hurt, I finally felt like I could breathe again. And you know what? The moment I shut that door behind her, this strange calmness washed over me. I wasn't angry, sad, or even surprised anymore. It was like all the energy I'd spent on her for years, all the regret, the guilt, the constant wondering, it had all just vanished completely. I finally got the closure I didn't know I needed, and I was ready to move on. This time, it was really over. But of course, things didn't end as cleanly as I'd hoped. A few days later, I got a text from her mother. She apologized, saying she was embarrassed by how her daughter had handled everything and that she'd tried to talk some sense into her, but it obviously hadn't worked. Her mom was a good person. She had helped me a lot after her daughter left, and I could tell she was genuinely affected by all of this. I didn't hold any resentment towards her, but I had no interest in getting dragged back into that mess. I simply replied with a thanks for asking and left it at that. I wasn't going to give her any more details, and I wasn't going to waste my time explaining my decision. She understood enough to know it was over. The following week, I found out some details through mutual friends and social media. Apparently, she had moved back in with her parents, and it wasn't going well. The guy, the one she left me for, the father of the child, wasn't involved at all. He'd completely disappeared. I guess he wasn't ready for a long-term commitment, and now she was stuck trying to figure it out on her own. She'd burned nearly all her bridges, so there weren't a lot of people willing to help her. Her old friends, the ones who were on my side when she disappeared, didn't have any sympathy for her. They'd all moved on and didn't want to get involved in her drama again. I didn't blame them. Her parents weren't exactly thrilled either. They weren't in a good financial position to support their daughter and a baby. I knew this because shortly after her mom's text, I got a call from her dad. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. He was polite but direct. He told me they were having trouble making ends meet and suggested that maybe I could help out a little. He talked about how much he loved his daughter and kept mentioning the baby and how difficult things were for them. I listened politely, but when he started pushing about how his daughter just needed a bit of support to get back on her feet, I couldn't help but chuckle a bit. Not out loud, but they got the message. I told him, as nicely as I could, that his daughter's decisions were her own and that I wasn't in any position or mood to help. I think he understood the message because he didn't push it any further. Then some of her friends started contacting me, people I hadn't heard from in years. Some tried the guilt trip, saying she was going through a hard time and maybe I could find it in my heart to give her another chance. One of her friends even had the audacity to suggest that the kid needed a father figure and that I shouldn't let my bitterness stop me from helping him. But I held my ground. I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel bad for finally choosing myself after years of feeling like I'd never be enough. I'd given that woman everything I had, and she threw it all away. The least she could do was own her decisions instead of expecting me to bail her out. Eventually, the calls and messages dwindled, and then they stopped altogether. It was like everyone finally understood that I meant it, that I'd moved on, and I wasn't going to fall for it again. And that's when the real peace settled in. My life felt quiet, normal, in a way it hadn't been in years. I had my routines, my friends, my job. It wasn't some fancy or glamorous life, but it was mine, and I'd rebuilt it my way. The funny thing is, I started to find happiness in the small things again, things I hadn't noticed when I was married. I'd go for walks, cook my own meals, read books I'd been meaning to read for years. The freedom was refreshing, and I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to live my life the way I wanted to. Finally, I wasn't constantly worried about someone else's approval or happiness. It was like I'd reclaimed my life, piece by piece. Every now and then, I'd run into someone who knew both of us and would ask what happened to her. I'd give a short answer and change the subject. It wasn't that I was hiding anything. I just didn't want to keep revisiting a chapter that was clearly closed. She was part of my past, and I'd finally learned to leave her there. As for her, last I heard, things weren't going well. She was struggling to hold down a job, bouncing between her parents' house and the couches of friends who'd run out of patience. People she barely talked to would message me from time to time, telling me she was asking for help from anyone who would listen. Some even hinted that she was hoping I'd change my mind, that maybe I'd come to my senses and decide to take responsibility for the child after all. But that wasn't going to happen. I had put in too many hours and too much energy into rebuilding my life to even consider that possibility. I wasn't going to be her safety net. I wasn't going to be the guy who picks up the pieces just because things didn't go her way. That chapter was closed, and nothing was dragging me back into it. In the end, I feel like I got the closure I needed. She made her choices, and now she was dealing with the consequences. And I finally felt free. Truly, genuinely free, in a way I hadn't felt since the day she left. I was determined not to let her shadow keep haunting my life. I had moved on, and I was content. Not happy in some dramatic sense, but in a quiet, contained peace. And you know what? That was enough.